Right, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. People are coming in. Admit. All right. Wait for others to show up. Should be a few more people coming, I think. Mute. Oh, yeah, that's it. Only three of us here today. All right. Um, we're having a bit of a flash flood here. It's been raining incessantly for the last almost 48 hours now. So there's a flood happening here. Internet has been fine. Certain areas have been reporting a little bit of instability in their connections, but I think we should be okay. So anyway, here we are in the 10th session. We're going to read finish this first section of this book today. And then next week we will start on the second Ishraq, the second section of the Wisdom of the Throne, which gets into some very interesting theological issues, the resurrection and the post-mortem state and what heaven and hell are from this Sadrian perspective. So, number 14, principle on the relation of soul and body. He says, the directly immediate agent that causes motion or change in all types of motion is nothing but nature. By nature, he is obviously talking about the universal nature, the tabi'a kulliyah. This should be, if you read this section, it should be fairly evident that this is what he's talking about. So if we go back to our readings of Ibn Arabi, in the Fusus al-Hikam, we will recall that universal nature, the tabi'a kulliyah, is the place for the phenomena of all dualities. And so in the next couple of sentences, in the next paragraphs, this becomes fairly evident about what he means by this. So he says, nature is the essential principle of every motion, whether it be employed by the soul as involuntary motion, or when it is constrained by an external force, and such as the motion by constraint when a rock is thrown upwards, or in some other form, as for example, in what is called natural motion. For all motion is like a person whose spirit is nature. So he's basically taking the standard categories of Aristotelian physics, but the intention here is completely Akbarian. Now, Bahmanyar, who was Avicenna's successor, raised the difficulty in accordance with his master Avicenna concerning motions caused by the soul. How is it, he asked, that in this case, the same nature, capital N, is transformed so as to become the cause of motion in the bodily members against their natural demands, in such a way that there is no tension, despite the contending pulls of the demands of the soul and the natural demands of the body? His problem can only be solved by recognizing that nature, which is subjugated to the soul, is free to the soul in free obedience, and which is one of the soul's own powers which it employs, and through whose intermediacy it performs the different actions of the body, is something other than that nature which exists in the material elements and separate members of the body. Indeed, this nature proper to the soul is a certain level among the stages of the soul, whereas that nature which remains in the body after its connection with the soul is cut off is something other than the one we just mentioned. Fatigue, tension, illness, bodily corruption, and the like only occur due to the resistance of this second bodily nature to obeying the soul, not to the nature proper to the soul itself. The soul, therefore, has two natures subject to it, one of which emerges from its own essence, which is basically as an instantiation of the universal nature, and the second of which belongs to the elements of the body. So here we have a upper nature and the lower nature, the tabi'at ala and the tabi'at adna, if you would. The first it employs by its free obedience, and the second against a certain resistance. excursus on the unity of body and soul in the celestial spheres. On the basis of this recognition that nature is also one of the powers of soul, it appears that the first philosopher, Aristotle, was right in saying that the motion of the celestial sphere was natural and that its soul was naturally embodied in it. For it has been revealed to us through a luminous proof that the essence of the sphere, its nature, and its animal imaginative soul are one single thing in their being and individuality, differing only according to the three different stations of being in which they function. The sphere itself has no separate, immaterial, and purely intellective soul. So this is a pretty radical departure from standard Ishrahi or standard botany or just hermetic, templates about the nature of the celestial sphere. And in fact, this is actually a very Akbarian approach to the nature of the celestial sphere. The celestial spheres, the material celestial spheres, are only the material instantiations of their archetypes. Ibn Arabi gets very clear about this in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. Other one, Suhrawardi sort of suggests this, but then you have his prayers, in the Waradat al-Taqrisat, where he's actually making and offering prayers to the actual planets themselves. So he says, rather, it has an animal imaginative soul which imitates and resembles the intelligible form, the form of its archetype, and is connected to it as rays are connected to the source of light. The bodily nature of the sphere is likewise connected with its imaginative soul in a way like the connection of a shadow with the thing that casts it. But both the nature of the sphere and its animal soul, with the illimited imaginative powers of knowing that they each possess, are ceaselessly perishing and passing away with the continuous renewal and inflowing of their being. What endures of the sphere with God is a word, kalima, that is, the logos or intelligible form, permanently subsisting in its knowledge, as in his saying, what is with you is perishing, but what is with God is enduring. Number 16, concluding clarification on the contingency of the physical cosmos. Now that you know that every sphere has a perishable bodily mover, that is its animal soul, and a separate immaterial mover, that is its intelligible form, which is the aim of its motion, and that the directly immediate agent causing the heavenly motion is something essentially flowing and continuously renewed in its ipseity, it should be evident to you that this world is a realm of extinction, transience, and passing away, while the other world is a realm of stability, and that this realm and everything in it is dependent on that other realm. So it should be evident how it is that the heavens will be rolled up, and the planets will fall, their movements will cease, and their lights will be extinguished. For when the rising comes, the sun will be covered up, and the stars will be darkened, and the spheres will cease their revolutions, and the planets will arrest their motions. This is most surely happening. There's no doubt about it, but they will ask you about the hour when it will occur. Say, knowledge of the hour is with God. May he be exalted. And that was the conclusion of the first part of his book, and the 16th, 14th, 15th, and 16th principles of the first mashriq. So I now open the floor per usual to all of you guys. We don't have that many people. Here comes Reza. Riaz. It's a little late today. Let's let him in. There he is. Riaz, you missed the reading, but that's okay. You've already read it. I just finished the section. Whoever wants to go, the floor is yours. Whatever you want to talk about. Let me just turn on this air conditioner here, though. Anybody?
Okay, I will start from the end to the beginning.
Okay.
So here, when Mulla Sadra quotes the different Quranic ayats, obviously they fit very well with its explanation that even the heavenly bodies and heavenly spheres, they will go to their end, let's say, one day, and that they are not.
Not sabit. They're not sabit. They're not immutable for all time, which was a basic, Greco-Hellenistic and Hermetic idea about the nature of the celestial sphere that more or less you found in the first few centuries of Islamic philosophy, some of the philosophers subscribing to. But it's a very difficult idea, whether you take it from a purely empirical observational point of view, or if you take it from a scriptural point of view. But progressively, from even to some degree, Avicenna himself, all the way up to Mulla Sadra, this idea begins to be somewhat rejected. What Suhrawardi does with it is a very novel way to deal with this problem, in that he just basically takes the physical planets, the physical celestial spheres, as these material theurgies of a greater archetype. So that's a very Iamblican, very Neoplatonic approach to this problem with Suhrawardi, but no one clearly made the statement in this fashion that Mulla Sadra is making here, very unequivocally in the Wisdom of the Throne and elsewhere in his work, that these celestial spheres are not permanent things, right? That what is permanent is their archetypes, it's their intelligible reality. And these things themselves, the actual planets, they also, like any body, pass away, but like everything else that exists, like the humans, they also possess, besides their animal materiality, they also possess this intelligible and noetic reality or imaginative reality to them as well. So this was the resolution, which in essence then makes science, or even contemporary physics and chemistry and contemporary Western science, not necessarily incompatible with this kind of philosophy and this kind of existentialism. It's just your perception of the nature of the celestial spheres just depends on which standpoint you're talking about, whether you're talking about them from a material perspective or from an archetypal.
Yes. Besides the Quranic ayats, what other possible arguments or motivation could Mullah Sadra have to come to this conclusion, hypothetically?
Oh, I mean, it's not difficult. If every substance in the universe, from an empirical observational point of view, has a duration in time, then when you have the noetic principle already embedded within the Quran itself, on and on these examples go. Everything passes away. Nothing is permanent. Only the face of your Lord is permanent. Everything else comes into existence and passes away. Then, on the principle of even the primacy of being itself, the isalat al-wujud, by virtue of the fact that these quiddity, everything other than God is a quiddity, right? And quiddities are coming into being and passing out of being without any permanent being to them. They're mojud, they're not wujud. So, based even on that, kind of reasoning, it's pretty obvious that these celestial spheres lack permanence. And so it's just a very easy, logical leap to make to then say, that even they pass away, everything but the face of your Lord passes away. But if we want to also then maintain some level of integrity about the original Hellenistic Hermetic notion of the permanence of the celestial spheres, all we do is transpose the material reality to the intelligible and the noetical, which is at the level of the Ayana Thabit. That's where their permanence occurs. Yeah.
Okay, the next one, which I wonder, it is about the other sides. What is the motivation, for example, of figures like Sheikh Suhrawardi and the others, which maintain the eternality of the heavenly spheres? How would they respond to the Quranic ayats, which are at least on the surface level, saying the opposite. What would be their answer?
Their answer is not difficult. First of all, they do on one level recognize the impermanence of this, right? But with someone like Suhrawardi, who is kind of approaching all of these questions from a sort of quasi-pagan position, but pagan in a Neoplatonic sense rather than any kind of crass sort of way. Every object is a material theurgy of its principle, right? So even if the matter of it may pass away, the principle by which at that very moment that matter is embodied holds a sort of permanence. So therefore, from Suhrawardi's position, I'm reading into Suhrawardi here, but from that position, therefore, he can justify the construction or the composition of prayers to Venus, to the moon, to Mars, Jupiter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But starting, the first of his prayers, first cycle of his prayers is to the light of lights, right? And then follows his laudation to these disconnected intellects, which he names by the old Persian Zoroastrian name, Bahman Nur, he calls it, etc. The first intellects, and then he starts to roll out, and he's then associating some of these lower intellects to the seven planets, Jupiter to this, Saturn to Kayvan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So using these old Persian Parsi names, and in Arabic, I might add.
So if I get it right, then the position of them, both Suhrawardi and Mulla Sadra, it is not so different, but what Suhrawardi applies to the material theurgy, Mulla Sadra transfers to the kelimet, to the...
Yeah,
okay, thank
basically.
you very much.
But Suhrawardi would not disagree with what Mulla Sadra said here either at all. He wouldn't say. His only point of departure would only be at the level of his praxis, right? About how then we can approach the celestial. How do we approach the mashriq itself, the celestial mashriq? And as a Neoplatonist, as a Hermeticist, and also as a kind of a crypto-Zoroastrian, these material things that are in front of us are sort of the material gateways to that. So only from that sense do they possess any kind of sanctity, right? And that's all. Whereas with Mulla Sadra, it's more straightforward, and he's saying, well, okay, if you feel that way, they possess sanctity, but really from the greater ontological perspective of the primacy of being, they don't. They also pass away.
That is one of the things which, especially for me, is very beautiful with the cosmology of Sheikh Suhrawardi, because it is very easy, even for the simple-minded person, example like me, when we say, okay, we see two things. The sublunar world, it is in constant kaun and facade, compositing and decomposing. But the celestial world, we see it, at least it seems to us to be eternal. Now,
Yeah.
when you compare the sublunar world to the celestial world, even they are both material, here we see a very clear difference between the two. Then further, let we see this comparison to reach the conclusion that the whole material world compared to the immaterial world of souls, intellects, and so on, it is in the same relation that there's two parts of the material. And my question is, you have already answered it, that here in the cosmology of Mulla Sadra, we just transfer it to the Ayana Sabite.
That's it. Yeah. That's the bottom line. Yeah. And then once we do that, because of the nature of the Ayana Thabita themselves as being, not completely real, but not completely unreal as well, then it's then a very logical next step is that then you go to the very source of things itself, which is wujud, you know, and that is the only permanence or the permanent al-Baghi, which is one of the names of God.
Okay, thank you, Sayyidi.
Yeah. Anybody else? The same?
I'm falling a little bit behind on my secondary reading, so apologies if I don't have
No worries.
too much to say. But I have it's just something I've been thinking about from last time, and I mean something I was talking about on the chat too. I seem to keep coming back to this question about normativity or norms or moral values, because we in Mulla Sadra's system we have this, you know, the existentialism, and I keep seeing that there's some parallels with like French existentialists. I mean, with obvious differences too, but I think that for me, I'm coming up against this problem when it comes to morality, and it comes up with the concept of the haraka jawhariya specifically, because, or maybe it's that, but also the asalat al-wujud, because when I think of morality, I'm thinking of like there's some idea of like some ideal self, but we don't have access to that. We don't have recourse to that.
This is very easy to resolve from this kind of perspective, and even from Ibn Arabi. Okay, all dualism exists on the plane of universal nature, right? So the question is, if you don't have dualitude and dualism and, you know, contraries and opposition, you know, do we have morality at all? Is there even a necessity for morality? Because that morality is sort of a regulatory mechanism between the opposites and the contraries and the oppositions that exist in this realm of universal nature, right? This is where I think a lot of deists kind of are shooting themselves in the foot when they have these discussions about this subject with atheists, is that, in my opinion, without a metaphysics, you can't really answer this question. So morality, if it is a phenomena that can only exist in the dualistic plane, right? Also then entails that as a consequence of the transubstantial motion, a value will indeed change from point A to point B to point C and on as we move through time, right? But this is only because of the consequence of the causality of time, right? It is the cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, and you know, the transubstantial motion, or if you want to call it evolution or whatever other term that you want to call it, because morality requires that causality to regulate, to be that mechanism, that the intelligible, as it were, to regulate the oppositions and the contraries that are occurring on a given plane. Atheists will always say things to deists that, you know, you deists are claiming that, you know, there can be no morality without God. On the one hand, the question is, yes, there can't be a morality without God. But on the other hand, the problem with the atheists is and the deists is that they don't understand what the nature of God even is. You know, they have this very, you know, infantile, exoteric notion of what the reality of God is, and they extrapolate because the God says so, then that makes it true, right? But from the point of this kind of wujudi perspective on God, because God is permeating every existence, because it is existence, right? And since we have a motion in substance, therefore that entails that at various segments of points of time, because the nature of these oppositional relationships, at least formally in, you know, in what we see out there in the world, change from one point of time, then contours of them, elements of them are going to change as well. This is not because God says so, but this is because, at least not in the way that the exotericist understands it, but because the nature of this moment in that transubstantial motion requires a certain regulation between the opposites in the world of phenomena, right? This is so we have to look at morality from a more phenomenological perspective and also accept the fact that morality on a very important level of it, on a very axiomatic level of it, is, is imkani, is contingent. For example, let's look at the birth of Islam. To the tribal Arab societies of the Jahiliyyah, right? They considered, for example, a daughter born into their tribe as the first child as to be a very evil omen. So they had this practice of female infanticide, something that one of the first things that the Prophet spoke very unequivocally against, right? But they believed this practice was good and that what Muhammad, peace be upon him, was saying was evil. But was it evil? From our perspective, what they were doing was evil. But from their perspective, what they were doing was the right thing. What Muhammad was saying was the evil thing. But what Muhammad represents is the voice, as it were, of that Haraka Johariya, right? Because that whole society had become so corrupt and so oppressive and classist and, in every conceivable way that, if you go back to your Star Wars lore, the Force, basically produced its own chosen one in the form of the Prophet, right? The Force here being Allah Subhanahu. So then man God speaks and establishes as a principle and as an axiom of praxis becomes that standard, that touchstone, that mahak, right? That then is functioning to regulate that imbalance that had crept up into that society. So we have to, I've said this to theists, I've said this also to atheists. You must, when you are talking about morality and philosophy or any kind of philosophy of ethics, you must have a historical understanding and consciousness over this problem at every step of the way. And at every step of your reasoning, you must be well informed of the minutiae of that historical development within that thing, right? Because that is the vantage point from which we are, observing the world and understanding its causalities, etc. Yes, we can speak from this very abstract, completely metaphysical, non-dualist realm, but that realm has no, bearing immediately on this question, other than the fact that to say that as a position, as an axiom, that realm is the embodiment of the name al-bar, the good, right? But once we're talking about the realm of universal nature, where all these dualities and dualisms and conflicts and oppositions occur, then by nature there must be some kind of even from an intelligible point of view of the human actors in it, some form, even if it's artificially constructed on some level, something to regulate these relationships. Otherwise, if there's no morality, then basically what is regulating one person from basically walking into his friend's house, stealing his stuff, jumping in the sack with his wife, killing him, etc., etc. These sorts of things need to be regulated. So this is a very complicated question, but I don't think either atheists or deists quite understand this question. But Plato himself, I can't remember exactly which of the dialogue, but in one of the dialogues, he basically scoffs at the idea that something is good and true because the gods say so. Did you remember what
the Euthyphro?
Yeah, the Euthyphro. That's right.
Euthyphro.
So, and then he demonstrates how actually what the good is something else. It's not because the gods say it so. It's because of these various relationships that we're talking about. So that is how I understand. I approach the question of morality. And this is how someone like Mulla Sadra would definitely approach this question as well. With Ibn Arabi, this is implied. He never talks about it in those specific terms. Where he articulates it, he's articulating it from a very Quranic theological point of view, but then in his own Gnostic the excursus throughout the Futuhat al-Makkiyah and elsewhere, this is basically what he's saying. But where God is concerned, God specifically, at the level of God, there is no morality.
So I think where I get a little caught up is in, because I was making the comparison with like French existentialism, where they also will say existence precedes essence, right? They have a kind of a salat al-wujud position, and the problem that they come up with that leads them to is that the values only come into being with the flow of existence. It's only when we make the choices that values are established.
Yeah.
But the way that you're explaining it makes it sound like the values are inherent in wujud, like in the unfolding nature.
They're not, well, values, let's put it this way. If we take a specific value in its manifestation at any given point, then it isn't inherent, because that thing is already just a moment in a larger transformative process that has brought it to that. Where in this trajectory, it has gone through a whole lot of change and evolution, and it's not what it was at the beginning. If we take it from that sense, no, it is not inherent. But if we take it that from at least the point of view of one segment of the existence, namely us, the humans, that when we are looking at certain causal things, whether with each other or whether in our own struggle with the natural world, then certain axioms arise. Now, whether they are inherent in the sense that a Platonist would understand the nature of inherence, that is debatable. And I think what makes that debatable is precisely what Mulla Sadra is putting his finger on in terms of the transubstantial motion of things. So even that value, what is inherent is the causality, not the actual value itself. That in itself would be like a relationship. It would be an intelligible, at the same level of what Ibn Arabi tells us about the nature of names. So it is both existent and non-existent. And when we, bring in the transubstantial motion, then this thing is forever transforming in its essence. So that inherence is not the value itself. It's the actual substance, the universal substance of things, or the universal nature.
I think I still don't. It's still not coming to me. Because the whole thing about the ayan thabita, if what is principle is wujud, and the ayan is a reflection of the wujud, then the ayan can't be any kind of standard for the way in which wujud should unfold.
Well, it's not a standard. It's the way that at that particular level of the ayan, wujud is refracting itself.
Right. So, but it can't be used as any kind of like template for what to do.
No. The template for what to do where morality is concerned, in my opinion, is not even metaphysics. It's sociology and history. Metaphysics can explain morality and ethics from a kind of a general ontological and epistemic kind of position, but to really get into the meat of this and to really understand it on its application, its level of practice, you have to get into sociology and social sciences and history to grasp it. So I disagree with a lot of religionists on this, because they seem to suggest an inherence of morality. And then that inherence of morality to them is the word itself. It's spoken. In other words, what they mean by it is that God has spoken the good and bad, right? Whereas the good and bad are relational and historically located, and in many and in most cases socially constructed.
I was thinking that maybe Sadra has a way of grounding morality in ontology with the idea of intensification of wujud. That for a human being to become more intense is to become more conscious and more virtuous.
Yeah.
Um,
But let's take the sentimental moral language out of that, because that intensity doesn't necessarily make you, what it makes you is more attuned to the overall causality of things. For example, if I do this, X will happen, and if X happens, then it will unleash this chain of events that will do, ABC to whoever, right? So what the insan kamil does is mindful of their actions, so that the causalities that are emanating from them are in some sense contained in producing salutary results rather than negative results that usually arise from not knowing what you're doing. So this becomes very Platonic. So morality in a more Platonic sense would be the knowledge, right? So this would be the aql, and amorality or immorality would be the jah. So the more knowledge, gnosis, understanding that you have, the less you engage in actions that may be deemed immoral. But the less you have, then you're because of that nafs al amara, who's compulsive all the time, you're compelled to be immoral.
but where moral and amoral are being determined historically and sociologically.
Well, I mean, certain set of principles and values, I mean, I hesitate to use this word, at a given point for a given society are by consensus deemed to be inherent, although they're not. So one behaves or navigates rather through that at that given point. Whereas if one was living at another point in time, further divorced from this point of time, then all of those things, that consensus is no longer, from this point of time, is no longer inherent in that other point of time. There's been massive shifts, massive changes. Certain basic things don't change, like, don't kill and, don't steal and that sort of thing. But, you can be a virtuous thief. Such a thing exists, right? For example, the whole Robin Hood phenomena, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Robin Hood is still a thief, but the hoarders, who are the sheriff of Nottingham and the king of England at the time, they are the real, malevolent thieves here. So what Robin Hood is doing by taking from the rich and giving to the poor is actually not theft. That is the real morality. And so this is in all of these various, little details of things is where we understand that there are no fast rules around this, in the way that most lockjawed exoteric people kind of think about these issues. And they think of it merely from a very surface axiomatic point of view. Analytical in the way that they're approaching it, let alone noetic.
I won't press you any further. I feel like I've pressed you enough, but because for me, it still isn't coming clear to me, because I was just, if I had to push it further, I would just say, well, I still don't know the source of those values. Like, if they're, we find them in history, and by careful attention to history, I still don't know where they come from.
Well, the source of everything, whether it be a value or the opposite of it, is God. Okay, God is the guide and the one that leads the astray. So God is both the emanator of the good and the emanator of the evil. A problem that most exoteric people have with this concept. How can God be the author of the evil? Well, if God is the author of all things, then everything that is perceived as being the opposite of the good must also have as its author the one itself.
Well, that would seem to return it would return it to ontology then, because
Yeah.
then God is emanating.
Yeah.
He's emanating. So then it's a matter of just having an intuition of what that is at any given time.
Yeah, but that ontological level is at a level where the immediacy of the question of a moral action or inaction, in some way, that higher level may obscure, right? Whereas if you're looking at it from the point of view of the horizontal level of society in the world and history, and that kind of analysis, right? Then you know exactly where to locate the actual action for a given, thing.
But what is guiding it within that historical context is that transcendent sense.
Transcendent logical reality. Yeah.
So it's both. It's about knowing it and also knowing how to apply it.
Yeah.
So it's at the level of God's. See, then it goes back. I go back to so when at that universal level, is it just what God decides to emanate as good and emanate as evil?
Well, it's God has decided to emanate all things equally at that very instant, whether it be the pole of the dialectic of the negative or the pole of the dialectic of the positive, right? But
God is the one who's deciding which is the positive and which is the negative. Like the criterion for what is which is which.
God is that. I mean, from one level, we can say God is not even necessarily deciding that, other than the fact that from the human level, right, these poles occur in a certain way as either negative or positive, right? So then it is incumbent on the human creation to listen to that voice of God, in a sense that is advising it, avoid this, right? Do this. Not so much because, what is emanating out of God is necessarily God is judging that emanation. No, it's in a sense, ethics from a religious theological point of view comes then merely a advice template about how to navigate the nature of this, as to what is, either harmful or beneficial to that nature. Whereas for another nature, either on a higher level or even on a lower level, what is deemed to be opposite and negative may, in fact, occur in a completely different way. In fact, the opposite of what it occurs for the human subject.
And so when you say beneficial and harmful, we mean that in just a common sense way?
Yeah,
what just
basic way, yeah.
What subjectively is good or bad. Like we don't want pain and we don't want suffering, and we want to minimize that and maximize good. And
I instance the example of the female infanticide practiced by these Qurayshis during the Jahiliyyah. At the point that just before the revelation of Islam occurs in Arabia, this practice was one of many toxic practices that was turning that society into an incredible meat grinder, right? You had these very few elites who had accumulated a lot of wealth and continued to accumulate a lot of wealth. They had many, 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 many slaves. And so the population of Mecca, the majority population, were the disadvantaged. And this was creating all kinds of disequilibriums, not only in that society, but in the surrounding environment. So, even if you want to take God as tabia, right, as a tabia kulliya, it was inevitable that there would be a self-correcting mechanism from within nature itself to stop that. And so one of the first things that the Prophet of Islam speaks against as he begins his assault against the entire nature of that society, of that extremely toxic society, was precisely over the nature of female infanticide that these Jahiliyyah Arabs practiced. And then everything kind of followed from that, with the whole premise being La ilaha illallah.
Okay, that's all I got. That's the.
This is something I would like to explore as deep as we can go. I mean, so bring it up every time you want to bring it up.
If you allow me to we are talking about the sociological context, I were always wondering what means the Quranic ayats which are saying يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر, which very superficially would be translated, they command the good and forbid the evil. But
Yeah.
when you are going to the roots of the word ma'ruf, it's what is socially accepted, and munkar, again, it is what is the opposite, rejected by the
Yeah.
but
I mean,
if we accept that it is
Ma'ruf, Ma'ruf, from which we also derive in its masdar the word urf, which means custom, right? That is the connotation of it, but with this kind of nuance to its meaning. What is ma'ruf, which usually gets translated in English as well known, right? Is this. When something, when a command to a ma'ruf, amr bil ma'ruf is being made, right? And there's been a lot of commentary on this, and you find it in some of these, big lexicographical Arab dictionaries. Something that to give an amr bil ma'ruf can occur to enjoy or to enjoin the good is another way to translate it. Only can occur in a position where the opposite is in front of you. So if, for example, let us say, what's a common one? You're in an environment full of Muslims, and right next door to you there's this bar, and there's all these Muslims walking out of the mosque after salat and going and getting drunk off their heads, right? And so someone does amr bil ma'ruf. They enjoin to the good. Why? Because let's say that these Muslims who after their prayer have gone into the bar and are getting drunk, and all of a sudden all these women are coming out of the mosque, and these guys are so drunk they start to attack all these women, when this is completely not only haram from an from a scriptural point of view, but it also upsets the order of things, right? It unleashes chaos. So an amr bil ma'ruf, enjoining to the good, which is an enjoining to convention, is an enjoining to a equilibrium or order of things, a real order of things. This is the assumption. So, and usually, and we also, there's a few hadith in Bihar al-Anwar from the Imams that are also cited to that end. So, one of the functions of amr bil ma'ruf primarily was to do that in a situation of fitna. So if there is fitna going on, if there is internal conflict in a society, like what we witnessed in the generation immediately after the death of the Prophet, right? Whoever enjoined to the good was acting according to the injunction of the Quran. Because the point of having an ummah was not for people to go at each other's neck over the issue of the leadership. Who is the Khalif, or who is this, or who is that? The conflict that then these Sahabis initiate, whether it be Zubair, or whether it be Aisha, or whether it be any of these people, right? So because they were in that, they were engaging in the munkar, the evil, that which is destructive of the convention of that environment, of the good of that environment. So what is the corrective mechanism? The corrective is the amr bil ma'ruf, enjoining to the good, which is the enjoining to the convention, which is the command of the equilibrium, which is God.
Okay, but when if we say if we take the word exactly from its root, that it is the convention, it is the custom, it is the accepted practice in society, this would lead exactly to the relativism in the good sense of the word, which we were speaking about here. That what is accepted for one society could be completely different from what is accepted for another society, and for both and in the both cases it would be the most proper action according to to
But
their
the standard in, well, obviously when we have Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy an Munkar in the Quran, the standard in which this dialectic is supposed to operate is the Quran itself and the Sunnah, right? So that is the standard. So, but you're absolutely 100% spot on that even that standard is historically located. It cannot be immutable for all time, which is basically an argument that the Bab makes in the Bayan. It's all contingent. Everything other than God is contingent, including the book, the Sunnah, religion, everything.
So basically, if we are put very, very simple, if we are trying to judge our times and our society by the measures, for example, of the society before 100 or 200 years, we are basically doing wrong. We are not
Yes.
correct.
Yeah, 100% correct. Yes. Because the standards by which these people were operating and the causalities that they understood were very different to ours. Now, some people will then want to kind of jump on their, they will want to judge on the basis of inferior and superior. But even that is subjective. It's a very subjective assessment. Which kind of, the imputation, especially by modernist Western thinkers, is as that pre-modern societies are by definition stupid because they don't understand these, sort of, very elevated instrumentalities of reason that we have. They're superstitious, they're, this, that, and the other, but that's not necessarily true. When you look into ancient history and, with all the great archaeology and translations and analysis that we've had in the last 200 years, we're beginning to realize that some of these ancient societies, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, the Mesoamerican, the Indus valleys, the Chinese, for God's sake, had conceptions of the world, whether on the level of their own kind of instrumental reason or otherwise, beyond anything that we ever gave credit to these people. They were extremely sophisticated, and in some ways even more sophisticated than us. And I would argue that even the society that brought forth someone like Muhammad ibn Abdullah was itself in many ways very sophisticated society, albeit it was decaying and it corrupted. There was a lot of disequilibrium and problems in that society that was creating all kinds of mayhem around it, just like now in the world that we're living in today. Same thing. But to make that judgment call about, we're better than them because we're living, further a long time and we have all this very, nifty gadgetry and technology that these people did not. Yeah, but these people were also attuned to certain things that you didn't. And you don't. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so I guess one thing that's sort of sticking out to me is that Allah actually talks about in the Quran about how sometimes there be some things that are hateful towards you or that you really don't like to do, but that are very good for you. So for instance, like war, for instance, he chastises the believers at the time for basically being pussies, for, prioritizing their own self-preservation.
Yeah.
And obviously there are like, you can't say like self-preservation is bad in itself, right? It's just that in this particular case, it's better to fight in the way of Allah than to stay at home while you're being oppressed. And I think at the other perspective, there are cases, you see this a lot with how governments try to motivate people into war, where war itself and that impetus towards war becomes a sort of idolatry.
Absolutely.
In that case, giving into that impulse towards war, and sometimes these same governments will use these verses of the Quran to sort of tell people to go to war for them. Anyway, sometimes giving into this sort of impetus to war is following idolatry itself.
Yes, 100%.
And in this case, turning away from idolatry would be following your good old sense of self-preservation, which says maybe you shouldn't give up your impetus to live for something else. So I'm just wondering how much of this dilemma can be sort of reduced to a sort of sensitivity about what the moral direction you're following is in accordance with. Is it in accordance with?
Well, if we compare the struggle of the early Muslims to the reality that we have today in the West, where the government has essentially kind of supplanted God, made itself, it's the Pharaoh in a sense. It says, "Ana rabbikum a'la," the state. I am your Lord the highest, right? But it is not fighting for the common good. Arguably, the early Muslims were not only fighting for Allah, and they were not necessarily even fighting specifically for the person of Muhammad Rasulullah as the messenger of God, but all of these early Muslims, and especially in the period just before the beginning of the sanctions that the Meccan elite imposed on the Muslims in Mecca, the vast majority of converts were coming from the lower classes of Mecca. People who have been former slaves or current slaves, or even the non-slave lower classes of Mecca, disfellowship, dispossessed, poor, without any possibility of gaining any kind of social mobility in that society, right? These are the people that gravitated towards the message of the Prophet and, absolutely embraced the La ilaha illallah. And then for that, and given their condition under these pagan Qurayshites, they fought and they were willing to fight because they were not only fighting for a cause, they were fighting for themselves and for their own future and the future of their children, to live in a better kind of society than the one that they had been living under the yoke of these, pagan Qurayshites, that whole system over there. The question is, and contrary to the propaganda that many Western governments say, we're fighting for democracy and freedom, the last 30 years has proven that to be completely nonsense. That in the West, these wars are fought for the elites. So the Western elites, in my eyes, are no different than the Quraysh, pagan Quraysh of that era of the Prophet, and you can call them that. So these Abu Sufyans and Abu Lahabs are the Trumps and Keir Starmers and what have you of our time that send all these young boys and young girls all across on the other side of the world to die for their specific monetary and financial interest to expand their markets and their portfolios and that sort of thing. But this wasn't what the early Muslims were doing. They were fighting for a better world, for social justice for themselves, for the possibility, if not for mobility, to become like these uber wealthy Qurayshites, to at least live in a world where that wouldn't be possible. Unfortunately, after the Prophet's passing, that didn't quite pan out because the Arabs went back to their old ways. But that was the motivation. And that's actually the Quranic motivation. And that's the reality. That's the real origin, the original understanding of what a jihad is supposed to be.
Right, okay, thank you. That's very elucidatory.
Jeff?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to change the subject.
Sure.
It's tempting to talk about current affairs politically and socially around the world, but I just wanted to ask you if you saw any kind of analogy between what we were reading. I already forget what we were reading. I'm seeing some kind of analogy between the nature of the sphere, like both. Okay, I'll just spit it out. The three gunas. I'm sorry to bring up an Indian metaphysical concept, and especially Allah, Gainon, because it's Gainon, of course, where I learned about the three gunas in the first place. And I'm just, for some reason, that kind of concept kept occurring to me as I was reading those sections. And do you have anything?
Yeah, it's basically simple. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
You can if you want to apply Indian metaphysics to understand Mulla Sadra, go for it. It works.
Yeah. And it's not that I want to do that. It's just that where I already have a little bit of familiarity in other metaphysical systems, when I read stuff in the Islamic milieu for the first time, it just keeps reminding me of stuff that I've learned in other, contexts. But I'm always a little concerned whether it's appropriate to make an analogy or draw a parallel here and there, or not.
Absolutely appropriate, 100% appropriate. You should do so. Yeah, by all means. Yeah.
I guess the question I was asking, I was thinking about the Quran, but I was also thinking about the Bhagavad Gita, because Allah tells us, like sometimes you got to fight because you got to fight for your right? But also in the Bhagavad Gita, it basically starts off with Arjuna very rightly saying that, like, if I go to war against my family members and I'm destroying all these ties of kinship, which are really important, right? And Krishna says, no, like, you've got to fight for because of something like bigger, right?
They're corrupted people. You must kill them. This is the message. The message of the Bhagavad Gita is God telling Arjuna to kill his own family.
Yeah.
So if people want to claim that the Quran is violent, or that the Bhagavad Gita is something to contemplate, yeah, of course, absolutely, they should contemplate. But that's the narrative of the Bhagavad Gita is that very thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there's that parallel, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really cool.
Which is essentially the message is, you must do what needs to be done. And you can't wuss out of it. Don't be a pussy. No offense to
right.
That's the message. Yeah.
Well, the reason why I said that earlier is because a lot of people tend to frame war in terms of this idolatrous masculinity, right?
Yeah.
Where you're sort of indulging this masculine. I almost want to call it like a false god. This false god of masculinity.
Yeah, but there's, the other side, especially when we go to India, these goddesses are not passive. The Durga, Kalima, even a water god like Saraswati, they're not passive goddesses that are just all about puff and fluff and peace and light, and they are ass kickers. I mean, if you look at the Devi Mahatmya, which is the text of the Shakta Tantra, where the whole story is about how the mother goes down into hell and is fighting these demons, and it's a story of blood and gore. That this goddess is just kicking ass, right, left, and center. So I think these paradigms, as they have been received in the West, have been corrupted. And even when we go into some of these ancient cultures and you look at what their archetypes of masculinity and femininity are, they're oftentimes very different than what we understand as these archetypes of man and woman. And so it is a fallacy, I think, and one which the New Age has clung to, that in order to be spiritual, you have to basically walk away from a fight. Well, every spiritual tradition, and especially thanks for mentioning this, the Bhagavad Gita is telling you to headlong go into the fight, sword drawn, ready to hack to pieces your own family members, for God's sake.
Okay, speaking of that, I'll take a swing with my sword right now.
Go for it.
Reyes mentioned something very interesting there with the word masculinity, because I noticed that's a problematic word that keeps coming up in the Western right-wing media sphere. They're always wanting to promote and emphasize this notion of masculinity, where it's all about strength, brute strength, and power. Power, good. Weakness, bad. Strength, good. Weakness, vulnerability, bad. As though, well, I think you already know what I want to say. Yeah. I'm not even sure what I want to say, but it's like these things, like trying to promote masculinity and strength and demonize weakness and vulnerability as though it's some sort of a liability or some sort of a evil in itself.
But then here's the question I have: then why is it in the Bible we have all these very strong women that have been demonized as bad, whereas the male masculine figure is like held off as the paragon of the real virile, godly man. And God himself in the book of Exodus is explained as being a man of war. But then figures like Jezebel, like Bathsheba, Samson's lover, what's her name? Delilah. These are all demonized, even though they are paragons, like extremely strong women. Another example of this, whether from the Quranic narrative or from even the biblical narrative, is Potiphar's wife with Joseph. Joseph is the weakling. If he's the true prophet, right? Why is he even allowing himself being seduced by this woman? That's why I took that entire narrative from both the Quran and the Bible and completely flipped it on its head, making Potiphar's wife the real hero of the story as a kind of a Shakti, goddess kind of figure that appears to Joseph to initiate him into the higher mysteries. That's my take on this story in the effulgences of wisdom. But the strong woman in this Abrahamic tradition is demonized, whereas the man who does the same thing, right, is the one that is lionized. What the hell is going on? But you don't find this in the ancient traditions. You don't find this in Egypt. You don't find this in Mesopotamia. Ishtar, the figure of Ishtar in the Mesopotamian lord, is a real interesting character because she has many different facets to her. She's both a protectress and also a warrior, and on it goes. All these various contraries that one associates, that occur very interesting enough in the Thunder Perfect Mind in the Gnostic Gospels. These are all the things that are attributed to Ishtar by the Sumero-Babylonians. Then you go into, whether the Indus Valley or ancient India and the Vedic civilization, and you get the same sorts of things about these goddesses, in their pantheon. It's only for some reason in the way that this Abrahamic tradition has been received over the last 2,000 years that these very, straitjacketed and very fallacious, paradigms about masculinity and femininity are imposed. The Romans didn't have it, for some reason. It's once the Abrahamic tradition comes to Europe,
that phenomenon just kind of is evidence of what the left, I hate to use these terms left and right because I myself I don't really I find it very irritating to think in left and right terms, and yet when you follow the news, political news, you have no choice because everything's framed in that way. But anyway, so on the left side, you've got criticism of the right of being, misogynistic and all about the patriarchy, preserving and protecting and trying to build back up this kind of a patriarchal system. So I think this is evidence. I mean, they want the strengths to belong to men, and they want vulnerability to belong to women.
This is the thing that didn't work. The fact that we're even at the stage with this, kind of reaction to bring something to back is proof that it didn't work. So they want to actually return to something that didn't work. Rather than to seek, a kind of a resolution to all these, dialectical polarities, to kind of generate something beyond it. They want to bring back something that they themselves have been victims of that didn't work, obviously.
Yeah. And when I agree. One last observation too about fighting for things and trying to preserve things. Like I've heard it said recently, things like Shakespeare, Western civilization produced Shakespeare, but is there any equivalent in a primitive civilization or in an Eastern civilization? Like what I'm trying to say is that the phenomenon of Shakespearean works being produced by an Englishman, somehow that's the epitome of human achievement, and everything should be measured against that. And that's what the conservatives want to conserve. And
if I was a Western chauvinist, I would be very offended right now for one reason. What happened to Sophocles and all these Greek playwrights? Would Shakespeare even be possible without them?
No, but that again, there's just more evidence of the agenda of these of these people that want to make that argument is that they're not really concerned about civilization or truth or anything. It's just more about
Power
yeah,
itself.
and concentrating it and making sure it's in a particular the hands of a particular group or demographic of people.
Yeah.
Like in this case, white Englishmen.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I
that's
don't have a problem with Shakespeare. I mean, I think there is a genuine sapiential dimension to Shakespeare himself. Martin Lings, to his credit, wrote this very great book, and others have written others stuff as well along the same line. That there's almost a mystery tradition angle to many of Shakespeare's stuff, whether
for
we're talking
sure.
about the sonnets or even a lot of the plays. There's some really deep stuff in there.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not putting him down by any means. I'm not extremely familiar with Shakespeare, but I've read a few, and I like it. But I don't think it's necessary to hold it up as the paragon of human excellence, especially if you're trying to demonize other peoples who. Anyway, this is riffing on what you were talking about earlier about, this notion that primitive peoples were superstitious, or I mean, earlier peoples were more primitive than modern peoples, as though people before Shakespeare were primitive. Then suddenly, with the Shakespearean
This is what I'm
era,
saying. These terms are all relative, and they come
yeah,
from a perspective in time, you know, and they don't serve anything, in some sense. I mean, I look at the world that we're in right now, and I think human beings are far less resilient in some very, very basic areas than our ancestors. So people 1,500 years ago were far more emotionally robust than we are. People who survived, because just remember, I mean, if someone got a little scratch in the ancient world and it infected, and there was nothing to disinfect it with, they would die. Period. So if you survive life, the rugged brutality of that, of the elements around you, and you survived it, you were both physically and emotionally far more robust. We are all snowflakes compared to that.
Yeah.
The slightest thing offends, the slightest thing disturbs, just these big balls of emotional naps all the time.
You don't even have to go back that far. I can see a difference between pre-internet people and post-internet people. I mean, there's been a change in people in terms of, psychological and resilience and capability. Just I find people are a lot more sensitive and a lot more fragile now that they have access to a bigger social network and more information.
Yeah.
They're more fucked up now than they were before.
They ever have been. And we have also managed to isolate ourselves unlike any other civilization. So for all the connectivity that we have, we also have the deepest levels of disconnection on an emotional level that we've ever experienced in human civilization. I can sit here, you're all the way across the world, I can talk to you, but my next door neighbor I may not see for a couple of months.
Yeah.
Right? And so this does something to the human psyche.
Yeah.
Especially when it's normalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, folks. Well, we've gone for an hour. Let's start on the first two sections of this second place of illumination. So principles 1 and 2 for next week. And as usual, we'll come back same time next week. Everybody be well. Hopefully our weather will change a little bit since there's a flash flood going on outside. And everybody be well. We'll see each other again next week. Y'all love.